I need to tell you about the day I came home from burying my father, and the thing I found sitting on my doorstep that I still can't fully explain without my voice catching somewhere in the middle. My name's Nathaniel Brooks. I'm 34. I work as a structural engineer, the kind of job that's all precision and calculation, load-bearing walls and safety margins, which I think is part of why I gravitated toward it. I like things that have clear answers. I like knowing exactly how much weight something can hold before it gives. My father's death didn't come with any of that clarity. He'd been sick for almost a year, the slow kind of sick where you keep adjusting your expectations downward every few months until the actual end doesn't even feel like a single moment anymore, just the last step of a staircase you'd already been descending for a long time. I'd moved back into the house I grew up in about 8 months before he died, once it became clear he needed more help than visits twice a week could give him. My mother had passed when I was 22, so it had just been the two of us in that house for over a decade. Him rattling around it after I left for college, me coming back into it once his health made living alone too risky. The neighborhood hadn't changed much in all that time. Same quiet street, same old oak trees, same mix of longtime residents, and the occasional new family, cycling through one of the houses that turned over every few years. The woman 2 doors down, Eleanor Voss, had moved in about a year before my father got sick. I didn't know her well, the way you don't really know most neighbors beyond waves across the lawn and the occasional comment about the weather. She was somewhere in her late 30s, kept mostly to herself, worked from home doing something with freelance editing that I only knew about because my father had mentioned it once after striking up a longer conversation with her at the mailbox. He'd liked her, in that easy way he liked most people. Said she had a kindness to her that didn't announce itself loudly, the kind you only noticed if you paid attention. I hadn't paid much attention, honestly. The last year had narrowed my world down to doctor's appointments and medication schedules, and the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love disappear slowly enough that you keep hoping you're wrong about how it ends. My father died on a Tuesday morning, quietly, in the back bedroom that used to be the guest room before it became the room equipped for hospice care. I'd been sitting beside him for most of the night, and somewhere around 5 in the morning his breathing just stopped being there anymore. No dramatic last words, no movie moment. Just a quiet absence where there had been presence a minute before. The days after that blurred together in the specific way grief blurs things. A haze of phone calls and funeral arrangements and people offering casseroles like food could fix the particular kind of hollow that comes after losing the last parent you had left. The funeral itself happened on a gray Saturday, small, just family, and a handful of his old co-workers, and a few neighbors who'd known him long enough to want to say goodbye properly. Eleanor was there. I noticed her near the back. Dressed simply, not making a show of her presence the way some people do at funerals, just standing quietly, present without needing anyone to acknowledge that she'd come. I nodded to her once across the room, and she nodded back, and that was the entirety of our interaction that day. I didn't have the bandwidth for anything more. I was running on the kind of numb autopilot that gets you through a funeral without actually processing that it's happening. It was evening by the time I got back to the house, my aunt having driven me home after insisting I shouldn't be alone with my thoughts on a day like that, then respecting my need for quiet enough to just drop me off instead of coming inside. I stood in the driveway for a minute after she pulled away, looking at the house that had been my whole world for the first 18 years of my life and then again for the last 8 months, feeling the particular weight of walking into it, now knowing it was officially just mine, no one else's name attached to the mortgage or the furniture or the quiet that was about to settle into every room. That's when I saw it. Sitting on the doorstep, right in front of the door, was a small wooden box, the kind with a hinged lid and simple, careful craftsmanship, the kind of thing you'd find in a home goods store, but that had clearly been chosen with some thought rather than grabbed off a shelf in a hurry. Next to it sat a covered casserole dish, still slightly warm, the kind of practical gesture that had been arriving at the house in waves since my father's diagnosis got serious. But the box was different. The box wasn't food. The box had a small folded note tucked under the latch, my name written on the outside in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. I picked it up carefully, the weight of it surprising me a little, solid in a way that suggested whatever was inside mattered to whoever had put it there. I looked around the quiet street, but there was no one in sight, no porch light flickering on next door, no sign of who'd left it beyond the note with my name on it. I carried both the box and the casserole inside, set the food down in the kitchen out of habit, and sat down at the table with the box in front of me, suddenly aware of how tired I actually was, the kind of tired that goes past the body and settles into the bones. I opened the note first. Nathaniel, it read, in handwriting that was careful and a little formal. like the person writing it had thought about each word before committing to it. I didn't want to intrude on a day that belongs to you and your family, so I left this instead of knocking. Your father gave me this about 2 months ago, when he still had good days mixed in with the harder ones. He asked me to hold on to it and give it to you after he was gone, not before, because he said you'd find a way to argue him out of giving it to you early, if you knew it existed, while he was still here to be talked to about it. I think he was probably right about that. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a kind man, and he talked about you with more pride than I think you probably ever fully heard from him directly. I hope this helps, even a little. Eleanor. I sat there for a long moment after reading it, the note resting on the table, my chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the funeral I just sat through, and everything to do with the specific, unexpected weight of finding out my father had been planning something this quiet and this deliberate in his final months, without ever once mentioning it to me. I opened the box slowly. Inside was a collection of things that took me a few seconds to fully understand. A small leather journal, worn soft at the edges like it had been carried around and handled often. A few photographs I'd never seen before. My parents young. My mother laughing at something just out of frame. My father looking at her the way people look at someone they can't quite believe they get to keep. And underneath all of it, a letter, several pages long, written in my father's handwriting. The same, careful, slightly slanted script I recognized from birthday cards, and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he still had the strength to write things down himself. I didn't read the letter that night. I want to be honest about that. I sat with the box open in front of me for a long time, looking at the photographs, running my thumb along the edge of the journal, but the letter itself felt like too much for that particular evening. The day already having taken more out of me than I had left to give to whatever was waiting in those pages, I closed the box carefully, set it on the table where I could see it, and went to bed without eating the casserole, without doing anything except lying in the dark, thinking about a neighbor I barely knew, quietly carrying something this important for 2 months without ever once mentioning it, without ever once making it about her own kindness. I read the letter 3 days later. I'd put it off longer than I meant to, partly out of fear of what it might say, partly because some part of me wanted to hold on to the unopened version of it a little longer, the version where my father's last words to me were still unknown and therefore still somehow alive with possibility instead of finish. When I finally sat down and read it, it wasn't dramatic in the way I'd braced for. It was just him, in plain language, telling me things he apparently hadn't found a way to say out loud while he still could, that he was proud of the man I'd become, not despite the parts of myself I sometimes doubted, but partly because of them, the carefulness, the precision, the way I dropped everything to come take care of him without ever once making him feel like a burden for needing it, that he wanted me to know my mother would have been proud too, even though she hadn't lived to see most of who I'd become, that he was scared, near the end, not of dying exactly, but of leaving me alone in a house that was about to get very quiet, and that writing this letter had been his way of trying to leave some of his voice behind in it anyway. I cried reading that letter in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the diagnosis, the full kind, the kind that comes out messy and unguarded once you finally let it. A few days after that, once the worst of the immediate grief had settled into something I could function around instead of something that stopped me entirely, I walked the 2 doors down to Eleanor's house, the box, and the unopened casserole dish in hand, mostly as an excuse to actually talk to her properly for the first time. She answered the door looking a little surprised to see me, the kind of surprise that comes from someone not expecting to be sought out after doing something quiet and private without any expectation of acknowledgement. "I wanted to return your dish," I said, holding it out, "and to thank you, properly, not just a nod across a funeral home." "You didn't have to come all the way over here for that," she said, taking the dish but lingering in the doorway, instead of immediately stepping back to let the conversation end there. "I think I did. Actually," I said. "What you did. Holding on to that for 2 months without saying anything. That's not a small thing." She looked a little uncomfortable with the weight of the compliment, the way genuinely kind people often do when their kindness gets named directly instead of left as something quiet and unremarked upon. "He asked me to. I just did what he asked. You could have just handed it to me at the funeral, or mentioned it existed earlier. Most people would have found some reason to bring it up sooner, even with good intentions. He was very specific about the timing," she said. "He said if I told you too early, you'd either try to read it while he was still around to watch you read it, which he didn't want, or you'd spend whatever time was left trying to ask him follow-up questions about everything in it instead of just being with him. He wanted the letter to be its own thing, separate from the last few months." I stood there for a second, absorbing the fact that my father had thought that carefully about how grief works, how the mind tries to fill in answers while there's still someone there to ask, and had deliberately chosen to wait until there was no one left to ask, so the letter could just exist as its own complete thing, instead of becoming a conversation that got cut short. "Can I ask how that happened?" I said. "You two getting close enough that he'd trust you with something like that?" She smiled at that, something a little wistful behind it. "We talked a lot over the last year. I work from home, so I was around during the day a lot, and he'd be out on the porch sometimes when the weather was good, before it got too hard for him to manage stairs. We started talking about nothing in particular, the weather, books, eventually more than that. He talked about your mother a lot, about you too, more than you probably realize." "What did he say? About me?" She considered the question carefully, the kind of consideration that suggested she'd actually thought about this before, not just improvising an answer on the spot. "He said you were the kind of person who shows love through actions, instead of words, which used to frustrate your mother a little when you were younger because she wanted the words too. But he said, watching you move back into this house, rearrange your whole life to take care of him without him ever having to ask twice, that was the loudest version of love he'd ever experienced from anyone. He just wished you said it out loud more, so you'd believe it about yourself the way he believed it about you." I felt my throat tighten at that. The specific kind of grief that comes not from losing someone but from realizing, a little too late, how much they actually understood about you, that you never gave them credit for understanding. "I didn't know he felt that clearly about it," I said. "I always worried I was failing at it somehow. The whole year. Like I should have been doing more, saying more." "He didn't see it that way," she said. "For what it's worth. He saw exactly what you were doing, and he never once doubted it meant what it meant." We stood there in her doorway for a while longer, the conversation drifting into smaller things eventually, the neighborhood, her work, the strange, particular quiet that settles over a house after someone dies in it. I found myself not wanting to leave, not because of anything dramatic, just because talking to her felt like talking to someone who'd actually known a part of my father I hadn't gotten to see in his final months, the version of him who sat on the porch and talked about things bigger than medication schedules and doctor's appointments. "Can I ask you something else?" I said, before I finally turned to leave. "Sure. Why didn't you come to me sooner, before any of this? We're neighbors. You knew my father was sick. You could have introduced yourself properly months ago, instead of just being someone I waved to occasionally." She thought about that for a second. "I think I didn't want to intrude on something that wasn't mine to intrude on. You were carrying a lot. The last thing you needed was a neighbor inserting herself into it, even with good intentions. I figured if there was ever a right moment, I'd know it when it came. And the doorstep, instead of knocking, why not just hand it to me directly?" "Because I thought you'd need the day to just be the day," she said, not interrupted by a conversation with someone you barely knew, even a brief, well-meaning one. "I figured you'd find it when you were ready to, and that felt like enough." I looked at her for a long moment, something settling into place that I hadn't expected to find in the middle of the worst week of my year. This quiet, careful kind of consideration from someone who'd had every reason to just hand over the box and let that be the end of her involvement, but had instead thought through every detail of how to make a hard day slightly less hard without ever once making it about herself. "Thank you," I said again, because it felt like the only thing that actually fit the moment. Genuinely. I don't think I would have known how to ask for what that letter ended up being, but somehow you and my father figured out exactly what I needed without me ever having to ask. "He knew you better than you probably give him credit for," she said. "I just helped finish what he started." I went home that evening with something lighter in my chest than I'd carried in months. Not because the grief had lifted. It hadn't. It wouldn't, for a long time. But because something about that conversation had made the loss feel less isolating. Like there was at least one other person nearby who understood a piece of what I'd lost, without me having to explain it from scratch. Over the next few weeks, I found myself walking down to Eleanor's more often than the situation strictly required. A coffee here, a casual conversation about nothing in particular there. She had this way of listening that didn't rush to fill silence with reassurance. Just let things sit until I was ready to fill them myself, which after a year of doctors offering careful, practiced sympathy, felt like a relief I hadn't realized I needed. About a month after the funeral, sitting on her porch one evening while the light went gold over the same street my father used to watch from his own porch a few doors down, I asked her something I'd been turning over for a while. "Do you think he knew," I said, "that we'd end up talking like this, after, Or is that reading too much into a kind gesture? She considered the question with the same careful weight she gave most things. I think he hoped, honestly. He mentioned once, a few weeks before he passed, that he thought you and I would get along, if we ever actually talked properly instead of just waving across lawns. I told him that felt like a strange thing for a dying man to be thinking about. He said, dying men think about exactly the things that matter most, and apparently that included wondering whether his son would end up talking to the quiet neighbor down the street eventually. I laughed at that, surprised, the first real laugh that had come easily since the funeral. That sounds exactly like something he'd say, subtle as a brick. He had his moments, she said, smiling. So this, I said, gesturing between us, the porch, the coffee, all of it. He sort of orchestrated this without either of us realizing it. Maybe a little, she said, or maybe he just noticed something true before either of us had the chance to, and decided to leave the door open instead of trying to push us through it. I sat with that for a while, watching the same light fall over the same street that had shaped most of my life, thinking about how strange grief is, how it can hollow you out completely, and then, sometimes, in ways you'd never see coming, leave behind something quietly good in the space it carved. We kept talking after that, regularly, easily, the kind of friendship that didn't need to announce itself as anything bigger than what it was in the moment. Months passed. The house stopped feeling quite so loud with absence. I started cooking again, actual meals instead of grief-numbed takeout, and more than once Eleanor ended up at my kitchen table sharing them. The same table where I'd first opened that wooden box, now slowly filling back up with the specific kind of life that comes after loss, instead of just the loss itself. It was almost 6 months after the funeral when I finally told her how I actually felt, sitting on that same porch, the conversation having drifted somewhere quieter and more honest than our usual easy, back and forth. I think I've been working up to something for a while, I said, and I think you probably already know what it is. She looked at me, something careful and a little hopeful behind her expression. I had a guess. I think my father gave me that letter, not just to say what he needed to say, I said slowly, but because some part of him knew it would lead me back to your door, more than once, until eventually I'd actually have to be honest about why I kept finding reasons to come back. That's a generous amount of credit to give a dying man's planning abilities, she said, but there was warmth underneath the dry humor, not deflection. Maybe, or maybe I'm just finally catching up to something that's been true for a while, and I didn't want to name it until I was sure it wasn't just grief looking for somewhere soft to land. And now? Now I think it's more than that, I said. I think it's you, specifically. Not just someone who happened to be kind during a hard year. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same street that had held all of this, without either of us noticing how much it was building toward something. I think I've known that for a while too, she said eventually. I just didn't want to be the reason you rushed past something you needed to actually grieve properly first. I think I have, I said. Grieved properly. It doesn't go away, not completely, but I don't feel like I'm drowning in it anymore. I feel like I'm just carrying it, the way you're supposed to carry the people you've lost, instead of being buried under it. She reached over then, taking my hand the way she hadn't quite let herself do in all the months of careful, deliberate distance, and something settled into place between us that felt less like a sudden beginning and more like the quiet conclusion of something that had actually started the night I found a wooden box sitting on my doorstep. For what it's worth, she said softly, I think your father would be glad it took this long, not because he didn't want it to happen, but because he wanted you to actually be ready when it did, instead of rushing toward comfort just because comfort was nearby. I think you're right, I said. He was annoyingly patient like that, even from beyond the grave, apparently. She laughed, the sound easy and warm in the fading evening light, and I sat there holding her hand, thinking about the strange, quiet architecture of how grief and love can sometimes build on the exact same foundation, how the worst day of my life had somehow also planted the seed of one of the best things that came after it, not because loss is ever something to be grateful for, but because sometimes the people we lose leave behind more than we realize, in places and people we wouldn't have thought to look, without their quiet, deliberate help. We've been together almost 2 years now. The wooden box still sits on a shelf in what used to be my father's room, now mostly mine, the journal and photographs inside it preserved carefully, the letter itself read again every year on the anniversary of his death, not because I need it to remember him, but because rereading it feels like hearing his voice again for just a few minutes, steady and certain in a way that still settles something in my chest Every single time. Eleanor still says, every time the story comes up with new people who ask how we met, that she just left a box on a doorstep and walked away. I tell them that's not the whole story, that what she actually did was carry something precious for 2 careful months, without once making it about her own generosity, then quietly waited for the rest to unfold, without ever pushing it faster than it needed to go. Both versions are true. Neither one is the whole truth. The whole truth is that my father spent his last months building something he never got to see finished, a bridge between his grief and mine, between an ending and whatever came after it, using nothing but patience and a neighbor he trusted enough to hand it to. And I think about that almost every day, how the people we love sometimes leave behind gifts we don't recognize as gifts until much later, quiet things sitting on doorsteps, waiting for us to be ready to pick them up. So tell me, if you came home from the hardest day of your life and found something unexpected waiting for you, quietly left by someone you barely knew, how would you have reacted? And have you ever discovered after losing someone that they'd been quietly planning something kind for you long before you ever knew to look for it? Let me know down in the comments. If you're grieving someone right now, please know it's okay to take your time with it, and that reaching out to someone you trust, or a grief counselor if that feels right, is never a small or unnecessary thing to do. And if this story touched you, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.